please. Don't take the cloth off, she begged. But the giant Apache did, and was shattered. In a snow-beaten frontier town, a broken warrior seeks nothing but shelter. Until he pulls away a white cloth inside a lonely church. Beneath, it lies not treasure, but a secret that will tear open his soul. The widow who begged him to stop is clinging to her last scrap of faith, desperate to bury her child with dignity. But the town's greed, the railroad's hunger, and the hatred in men's eyes will not let them rest. Together, the widow and the warrior must stand against fire, prejudice, and their own haunted pasts. Yet what burns hotter a church set, a blaze, or the shame buried in a warrior's heart? And when the cloth is laid back on the cross, will it heal what was shattered, or will it break them forever? What happens when a desperate plea, a stolen cloth, and a shattered soul decide the fate of an entire town? Your reactions reaffirm something simple yet powerful, that stories still shape us, even in silence. If you believe in the soft endurance of love, truth, and doing what's right, then you're exactly why these stories exist. The wind howled through the gaps in the church's weathered walls, making the tin lanterns sway and cast dancing shadows. Across the rough-hewn pews, Nantane's boots, caked with snow and mud, made heavy sounds against the wooden floor as he entered. The Apache warrior's massive frame filled the doorway for a moment before he slipped inside, bringing with him a gust of bitter winter air. Eyes that had seen too much death scanned the dim interior. The church smelled of dust and old hymn books, with traces of lamp oil and melted wax. Most of the pews sat empty, their surfaces dulled by years of disuse. But there, in the front, a solitary figure knelt before the altar. Karen Whitfield's shoulders trembled as she prayed, her dark dress a shadow against the pale altar cloth. Her fingers were clasped so tight her knuckles showed white, and her whispered prayers mixed with the whistling wind. The cross above her was draped in white fabric that stirred like a ghost in the draft. "Please," she said without turning, her voice raw with emotion, "don't take the cloth off." Nantan's scarred hands twitched at his sides. In his years of warfare, he'd learned to trust his instincts. Covered things held power, sometimes curse power. The white cloth drew his eyes like a snake drawing prey. His moccasins made no sound as he moved closer, despite his size. Karen's head came up sharply at his approach. Her face, young but marked by grief, showed fear at first, then something else. Not the usual hatred or suspicion he saw in white faces. This was different, desperate. "Please," she repeated, rising slowly from her knees. "Let it be." But Nantan's hands were already reaching. The cloth was soft, worn thin by time. It slipped away like water through his fingers, revealing what lay beneath. A small wooden box rested on the altar. No longer than his forearm, crafted from pine, its surface smooth and lovingly finished. A child's coffin. The sight hit Nantan like a physical blow. His breath caught in his throat as memories crashed over him. Small bodies after cavalry raids, tiny moccasins, empty and abandoned camps. His huge frame swayed. Karen made a sound like a wounded animal. "My Sarah," she whispered. "The fever took her 3 days ago. I couldn't. I haven't been able to." Her voice broke. Nantan's war-hardened heart cracked. His hands, which had dealt so much death, hovered over the small coffin but didn't touch it. The lamplight caught the tears on Karen's cheeks. "You need to leave," she said, but her voice held no strength. Her eyes fell to his hands, which had begun to shake from cold or emotion. He wasn't sure. Something shifted in her face. "Wait." She moved to a small table near the altar where a cloth-covered basket sat. From it, she drew out a loaf of bread, breaking off a generous piece. She held it out to him, her own hand trembling. "Take it, please." Nantan stared at the offered bread, then at the woman's face. In his experience, white women screamed at the sight of him or fled. They certainly didn't offer food to an Apache warrior who had invaded their sanctuary. Yet here she stood, grief-stricken but still showing kindness. The bread remained between them, a bridge across worlds of difference. His fingers, calloused from years of bowstrings and knife handles, carefully took it. The bread was still warm, but he couldn't move away. His eyes kept returning to the small coffin, its presence filling the church more completely than any sermon ever had. The wind continued its mournful song through the eaves, and the lantern swayed. But Nantan stood frozen. A giant trapped by the smallest of boxes, Karen watched him, her own grief momentarily forgotten as she witnessed something extraordinary. This fierce-looking warrior, undone by the sight of her daughter's casket. In that moment, something shifted between them. A recognition of shared humanity in the face of life's deepest sorrows. The storm raged outside. But in the church, two broken souls stood in silence before the altar, the small coffin between them. Testimony to both life's fragility and the unexpected ways grief could bridge. The widest of gaps, morning light crept through the church windows, pale and weak against the lingering storm clouds. Nantan's large frame shifted on the hard wooden pew where he'd spent the night. Sleep had eluded him, chased away by memories of war and the small coffin that seemed to draw his eyes no matter where he looked. The floorboards creaked softly. Karen. Whitfield emerged from the parsonage door connecting to the church, her skirts rustling as she moved toward the altar. She paused when she saw Nantan still there, but something in his quiet stillness kept fear at bay. "You stayed all night," she said. It wasn't quite a question. Nantan nodded once, his dark eyes reflecting the golden glow of the morning candles she'd lit. "There's porridge," Karen said after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not much, but—" She gestured toward the parsonage door. The kitchen was small but tidy, with a pot bubbling over the cook fire. The scent of thin porridge filled the air. Karen stirred it methodically, her movements, speaking of years of routine, now turned hollow. "I used to make this every morning," she said, not turning around. "Sarah loved it with honey, but we ran out. Months ago, her stirring slowed. Sometimes I wonder if he's run out too. God, I mean, like the honey jar, scraped empty when you need it most." Nantan remained in the doorway, his massive frame making the kitchen seem even smaller. He watched as she ladled porridge into two worn bowls, her hands trembling slightly. "I shouldn't trust you," Karen said, setting the bowls on the small table. "Everything I've been taught says not to, but—" She gestured to the chair across from her. Nantan moved with surprising grace for his size, settling carefully onto the chair that seemed too fragile for his weight. They ate in silence, the only sounds, the scrape of spoons and the persistent howl of the wind outside. After the meal, Nantan rose and walked back into the church, drawn again to the small coffin. His keen eyes noticed what Karen's grief blurred. Vision had missed the dampness from the storm had worked its way into the wood. The boards were starting to separate at the joints. Without a word, he examined the coffin with gentle fingers that had once notched arrows and wielded knives. Karen watched from the doorway, her breath catching as his huge hands cradled her daughter's final resting place with impossible tenderness. "The wood," he said, his deep voice soft. "It needs fixing." Karen's hand flew to her throat. "Can you?" Nantan nodded, already moving with purpose. He gathered tools from the church's maintenance corner, wood glue, small clamps, a worn hammer. With careful precision, he worked to repair the loosening joints, his movements slow and deliberate. Karen couldn't look away. This warrior, whom others feared, handled her daughter's coffin as if it were made of delicate pottery. His scarred hands smoothed the wood with reverence, tightening each joint until the small box was whole again. "Thank you," Karen whispered when he finished. Tears tracked down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. The storm had settled into steady snowfall, blanketing the church steps in white drifts. Without discussion, they both took shovels and began to clear the way. Nantan's powerful strokes made quick work of the heavy snow, while Karen worked steadily beside him. Townspeople passed by on the street, their faces dark with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. Some hurried past, while others stopped to stare openly at the strange pair, the preacher's daughter and the Apache warrior working side by side. "They don't understand," Karen said quietly, pausing to catch her breath. But then, neither do I anymore. She leaned on her shovel, looking up at the gray sky. "Every morning, I pray for a reason not to give up. Some sign that there's still purpose in all this pain." Nantan continued shoveling, but she knew he was listening. His presence was solid, unexpectedly comforting despite everything she'd been taught to fear. As dusk approached, the temperature dropped further. Karen moved through the church, lighting the lanterns one by one. She saved the small one near the coffin for last, its gentle flame casting a warm glow on the newly repaired wood. Kneeling before the altar, Karen closed her eyes. "Lord," she whispered, her voice carrying in the quiet church, "help me understand your path. Help me find strength to keep walking it." Nantan stood in the shadows near the back of the church, his warrior's instincts warring with something else, something that made him want to stay. To protect this grieving mother and her small coffin, his hands, still bearing traces of wood glue, opened and closed at his sides as he watched Karen pray in the growing darkness. The lantern flame flickered, casting long shadows across the altar. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the newly cleared steps in a fresh blanket of white, while inside, two lonely souls found unexpected comfort in each other's presence as night settled over the Colorado mining town. Dawn brought little warmth to the Colorado morning. Karen stirred the remains of yesterday's porridge while Nantan split wood outside, its rhythmic axe strokes echoing through the crisp air. The routine felt almost natural, though neither spoke of how strange it was to find comfort in each other's presence. The pounding came without warning, heavy fists hammering against the church's wooden door. The axe fell silent. "Open up in there," a man's voice boomed. Followed by more thunderous knocking, Karen hurried from the parsonage into the church proper, her heart racing. Through the frost-covered windows, she could make out three figures. On the steps, Nantan appeared silently beside her, his presence steady as a mountain. With trembling fingers, Karen unlatched the door. Mining foreman Chester Brooks stood there, flanked by two deputies, their badges gleaming dully in the winter light. Brooks thrust a paper toward her face. "Ma'am, this here's a foreclosure notice," Brooks announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority he clearly enjoyed wielding. "Church property's been sold to the railroad. Buildings coming down next week." Karen's fingers clutched the doorframe. "That's impossible. This is consecrated ground. Railroad don't care much about consecration, Mrs. Whitfield." Brooks adjusted his coat, frost clouding his breath. "Progress is progress." "But my daughter," Karen's voice cracked. "Her coffin. She needs proper burial in the churchyard. Should have buried her proper already, instead of keeping her inside, like..." Some kind of one deputy started, but fell silent as Nantan stepped into view. The Apache's massive frame filled the doorway, his dark eyes fixed on the three men. Brooks and his deputies instinctively backed down a step, hands twitching toward their holsters. "Now see here," Brooks blustered, though his voice wavered. "This here's official business. We don't need no savage interference." Nantan didn't move, didn't speak. He didn't have to. His presence alone made the threat clear. Harm this woman or her child's rest, and there would be consequences. "You got 1 week," Brooks spat, backing further away. And keep your pet Indian in check, Mrs. Whitfield, or we'll have more than property matters to discuss." The deputies followed his retreat, throwing nervous glances over their shoulders, until they disappeared around the corner. The moment they were gone, Karen's legs gave out. She sank to her knees on the cold wooden floor, tears flowing freely. "They can't," she whispered. "They can't tear it down. Where will I put her? How? Can I let them destroy holy ground?" Nantan knelt beside her, his movement careful, like approaching a wounded deer. "You will not face this alone." Karen looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes. "Why? Why would you help me?" "Because this is wrong," he said simply. His scarred hands, still dusted with wood shavings from the coffin repair, clenched into fists. "And because you showed kindness when others would not." The day passed in a haze of worry. Karen moved through her tasks mechanically, dusting the pews, sweeping the floor, tending the lamps. As darkness fell, she found herself sitting in the front pew, her father's old Bible open in her lap. "This is all I have left," she said softly. As Nantan approached, this Bible and her coffin, everything else. She traced the worn leather cover with trembling fingers. Father carried this Bible across 3 territories, preaching from it until his dying day. And now they'll destroy his church, desecrate my baby's resting place. Nantan stood silent for a long moment, watching the lamplight play across the pages of Scripture. Finally, he spoke. "Sleep, I will watch." Karen looked up, surprised. "You mean to stand guard?" He nodded once, already moving toward the door. His rifle, which had been propped in a corner since his arrival, now rested comfortably in his hands. "Sleep," he repeated gently, through the church windows. Karen watched as Nantan took up his post outside. Snow began to fall again, dusting his broad shoulders as he stood motionless in the gathering dark. The lamplight from within caught occasional glints of metal from his rifle barrel. She pressed her hand against the cold glass. Watching this unlikely guardian, this warrior who had shown more Christian charity than any of her neighbors. The Bible's weight in her lap seemed both heavier and more comforting than before. Outside, Nantan's breath frosted in the winter air as he kept his vigil. His keen eyes scanned the darkness beyond the circle of lamplight spilling from the church windows. No threat would reach Karen or her child's coffin tonight, not while he drew breath. The snow continued to fall, adding another layer of white to the ground that had already absorbed so many tears. Inside the church, a lamp flickered steadily near the small coffin, while outside, an Apache warrior stood guard, his silhouette a dark promise against the swirling snow. The first pale light of dawn crept over the snow-covered mountains, painting the church windows in weak winter gold. Karen stood in the parsonage doorway, wrapping a threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her old mare Sugar waited patiently beside the steps, breath steaming in the frigid morning air. "I must try," she said, more to herself than to Nantan, who watched her with concern in his dark eyes. "The county office opens at sunrise. If there's any justice left in this territory." Nantan shook his head slowly. "You should not go alone." "I don't expect trouble in town," Karen replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "And someone needs to watch the church." "I walk beside your horse," Nantan stated firmly. It wasn't a request. He checked his rifle, then leaned it carefully against the church wall. No sense inviting more trouble by carrying it into town. Karen didn't argue further. Truth be told, his solid presence brought comfort as she mounted Sugar with stiff, cold fingers. The mare's hooves crunched through the crusty snow as they set out, Nantan's long strides matching the horse's pace. The wind cut across their faces like tiny knives of ice. Karen hunched lower in her saddle, grateful for the extra wool socks she'd pulled on. Beside her, Nantan seemed unbothered by the cold. his face set in stern lines as they made their way down the winding mountain path toward the county seat. "Thank you," Karen said softly, after they'd gone a mile or so. "If you're coming with me." Nantan nodded once, but kept walking, his eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead and the rocks above. Old warrior habits died hard. The courthouse loomed ahead of them as they entered town, a stolid brick building with pretensions of grandeur in its columns and high windows. Karen's heart sank as she noticed the railroad's private coach parked outside, its polished wood and brass fittings gleaming even in the weak winter sun. She dismounted stiffly, her legs trembling from the cold ride. Nantan stood close as she tied Sugar to the hitching post, his presence drawing suspicious stares from passers-by. Inside, the courthouse halls echoed with their footsteps. Karen clutched her carefully written petition in one hand, her father's Bible in the other. The judge's chamber door stood open, voices drifting out. "Your Honor?" Karen called softly from the doorway. Judge Malcolm Pierce looked up from his desk, his jolly face registering first annoyance, then something like amusement as he recognized her. "Ah, the preacher's daughter." And his eyes narrowed at Nantan. "Interesting company you keep these days, Mrs. Whitfield." "I've come to file a petition regarding the church property," Karen said, stepping forward and holding out her papers with a slightly trembling hand. "It's consecrated ground, Your Honor. My daughter's coffin." "Yes. Yes," Pierce cut her off, barely glancing at the petition. "I'm aware of your situation, most irregular, keeping a coffin above ground like that. But the matter's already settled." He tapped a letter on his desk, expensive paper bearing the railroad's distinctive seal. "Progress waits for no one, Mrs. Whitfield." "But the law," Karen started. Pierce's face hardened. "I said it's settled." His eyes flicked nervously to the railroad's letter, then away. "The company has been more than generous in their compensation to affected property owners." "We received nothing," Karen said, her voice growing stronger with righteous anger. "No offer, no compensation, not even proper notice until yesterday." "Perhaps if you'd buried your child properly, instead of turning the church into your private mausoleum," Pierce suggested with cruel patience. Nantan's massive frame tensed, a low growl building in his chest. Karen laid a gentle hand on his arm, feeling the coiled fury in his muscles. "Please," she tried one last time. "There must be some justice." Pierce barked a laugh. "The territory's future is at stake here. I suggest you clear out that church and find somewhere else to pray." He turned back to his papers, dismissing them entirely. Karen's shoulders slumped as they walked back outside. The wind seemed colder now, bitter with defeat. Sugar nickered softly as they approached, and Karen buried her face in the mare's warm neck for a moment, fighting back tears. The ride home stretched longer than the morning journey. Karen slumped in her saddle, empty petition clutched in numb fingers. Nantan walked beside her in brooding silence until they were well away from town. "I thought," Karen's voice cracked. "I thought if I just had faith enough, prayed hard enough. But maybe I am cursed. Maybe God has turned his face from me entirely." Nantan was quiet for several steps, then spoke softly. "I carried a Bible once." Karen looked down at him in surprise. He'd never spoken of his past before. "A missionary woman gave it to me," he continued, eyes fixed on the snowy path ahead. "After I helped her escape raiders, she said it would show me a better path." His scarred hands clenched. "But then came more fighting, more scalps. I lost. It threw it away. Too much shame to carry both." Karen absorbed this in silence, understanding the weight of such a confession. The rest of their journey passed without words, each lost in their own thoughts of faith and loss. The church's simple spire came into view as dusk approached. Sugar's tired snort broke the stillness as they reached the steps. The building looked more fragile now, somehow, as if the weight of the railroad's greed could crush it at any moment. Karen dismounted slowly, her body stiff from the cold ride. The petition papers crumbled in her hand as she turned toward the church door, where her daughter's coffin waited in the gathering dark, evening shadows. Stretched across the parsonage kitchen as Karen stirred the thin stew bubbling in her iron pot, outside, the steady thunk of Nantan's axe splitting wood echoed through the cold air. The rhythm was somehow comforting, a sound of life and warmth in a world that felt increasingly hostile. She lifted the wooden spoon to her lips, tasting the broth. Barely enough salt, and the few vegetables were stretched thin, but it would have to do. The sound of chopping stopped, and through the frosted window, she watched Nantan gathering the split logs in his powerful arms. The sharp rap of knuckles on her door startled her. Standing there was Sarah Miller, the mine foreman's wife, her face pinched with righteous anger. "Have you lost your mind completely, Karen Whitfield?" Sarah's voice dripped with venom. "It's bad enough you've turned the church into a tomb, but now you're harboring a savage." Karen's fingers tightened on the doorframe. "Mr. Nantan is a guest. He's been nothing but helpful." "Helpful?" Sarah spat the word. "He's Apache. Do you know what his kind did to settlers out west? And you're feeding him? Letting him sleep in God's house?" She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "People are talking, Karen. They're saying you've gone touched in the head since losing your girl." The words struck like physical blows, but Karen stood straighter. "Then let them talk. God tells us to show kindness to strangers. God also tells us to be wise as serpents," Sarah shot back. "When something happens, and mark my words, it will don't come crying to us." She turned on her heel, skirts swishing angrily as she stalked away. Karen closed the door with trembling hands. Through the window, she saw Nantan watching from near the woodpile, his dark eyes understanding. He'd clearly heard every word. The stew was ready, but they needed bread. Karen counted the remaining flour, barely enough for one more loaf. Wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders, she picked up her empty flour sack. "I need to go to the store," she told Nantan as she stepped outside. "We're almost out of flour." He nodded, setting down his axe. "I come with you." The main street was busy with miners heading to the saloon after their shift. Karen felt the weight of hostile stares as she and Nantan walked toward the general store. The whispers followed them like slithering snakes. They were nearly at the store when a group of men stumbled out of the saloon, whiskey bottles in hand. Tom Burke, a mean-spirited driller known for starting fights, blocked their path. "Well, look here, boys," he slurred, spreading his arms wide. "The widow and her pet Indian, out for an evening stroll." The other men laughed, forming a loose circle around them. Karen's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her chin up. Nantan stood very still beside her, tension radiating from his massive frame. "Step aside, Mr. Burke," Karen said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're just going to the store." "Stores closed to savages," Burke sneered. His hand dropped to the pistol on his hip. "Maybe you need reminding what kind of company a decent woman should keep." The metallic click of the hammer being pulled back cut through the evening air. Karen saw Nantan's muscles coil, ready to move, and knew this could end in bloodshed. Something snapped inside her. All the grief, the fear, the anger at the town's cruelty rose up like a tide. She stepped forward, placing herself between Burke's pistol and Nantan. "He's with me." Her voice rang out, stronger than she'd ever heard it, echoing off the false-fronted buildings. "And God hears every word you say, Tom Burke. Every cruel word, every threat. They're all written in his book." The street fell silent. Even the saloon. Piano stopped playing. Burke's face twisted in confusion, his pistol hand wavering. "You've all forgotten what it means to be Christian," Karen continued, her voice shaking but clear. You've forgotten about mercy and charity and loving thy neighbor. Well, I haven't forgotten, and neither has God. The men shifted uncomfortably, looking at their boots, their whiskey bottles, anywhere but at Karen's burning eyes. Burke slowly lowered his pistol, though his face remained twisted with scorn. "Come on, boys," he muttered. "Ain't worth the trouble." The group shuffled away, leaving Karen and Nantan standing alone in the deepening dusk. Karen's legs nearly gave out as the tension drained away. She felt Nantan's steady hand at her elbow, supporting her. "The store really is closed," she said weakly, noticing the darkened windows. "We go home," Nantan replied quietly. "Bread can wait until tomorrow." The walk back to the parsonage seemed endless. Karen's whole body trembled with the aftermath of fear and anger. Inside, she sank into a kitchen chair while Nantan built up. "The fire? No one has done that before," he said after a long silence. Karen looked up. "Done what?" "Stood between me and a gun." His voice was low, thoughtful. "Not since the missionary woman, many years ago." Well, Karen managed a shaky smile. Someone should have. Later that evening, she stood before the altar where her daughter's coffin rested. The white cloth she'd draped over it had become symbolic somehow, both concealment and protection. She adjusted it gently, making sure every corner was covered. "For once," she whispered, touching the cloth's worn fabric, "I don't feel alone." In the quiet of the church, with Nantan's solid presence nearby and her daughter's memory held safe beneath the cloth, Karen felt something she hadn't experienced since the fever took her child. The faintest stirring of hope. The morning sun cast weak rays through the church's frosted windows, doing little to warm the chill air inside. Karen's hands trembled slightly as she poured steaming tea into 2 tin cups, the liquid dark and fragrant. Nantan sat across from her at the small parsonage table, his massive frame making the wooden chair seem like a child's seat. "We need help," Karen said quietly, pushing 1 cup toward him. "I've been thinking all night. We can't protect this place alone." Nantan wrapped his calloused hands around the warm cup, considering her words. His dark eyes held memories of both battle and betrayal. "There are others," he said finally. "Men like me." Outside the town's welcome, a Terran leaned forward, hope flickering in her chest. "Josiah Freeman. Lives in cabin past the mill." Nantan's voice was measured, thoughtful. "Fought for Union. Good with tools. Strong hands, stronger heart." Karen nodded slowly. "I've seen him at market sometimes. People avoid him, but he always tips his hat to everyone, even those who scorn him." Henry, too. Ute, scout. Nantan continued. "Knows these mountains better than any white man. Railroad men drove him from hunting grounds." He paused, taking a sip of tea, and Manuel Ortega. "Works stone like it's breathing clay. Lives with family in shanty by creek." The stonemason. Karen's eyes widened. "His work on the mining office is beautiful. I've seen him praying at the church door sometimes, though they won't let him inside. All men who understand." Nantan's voice carried the weight of shared experience. All know what it means to stand alone. They finished their tea in silence, then bundled up against the cold. The morning air bit at their faces as they walked through town, ignoring the suspicious glares and muttered insults that followed them like shadows. They found Uzziah Freeman splitting wood behind his rough-hewn cabin. His weathered face showed surprise at their approach, but his posture remained dignified, straight-backed despite his years. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, setting down his axe and touching the brim of his worn hat. "Bit far from town for a morning walk." Karen explained their situation, her voice growing stronger as she spoke of the railroad's threats and the need to protect her daughter's resting place. Josiah listened intently, his eyes occasionally meeting Nantan's in silent understanding. "Ain't right," he said finally, shaking his head. "Seen too much of men taking what ain't theirs to take." He looked at the church spire, visible in the distance. "I'll help. Got some fence post seasoning in my shed, might serve the purpose." Their next stop was the creek, where Henry kept his small camp, hidden from casual view. The Ute Scout emerged from the trees like a shadow taking form, his sharp eyes reading their intentions before they spoke. "The railroad men come for more?" he asked, his English clear but colored with bitter knowledge. "Always they come for more." When Karen finished explaining, Henry nodded slowly. "Your child deserves peace," he said. "And sacred ground deserves protection." His gaze met Nantan's. "I will help." They found Manuel Ortega working on a retaining wall near the mine entrance. His skilled hands never stopped moving stone as he listened to their request, though his eyes showed deep attention. "My own madre is buried far from here," he said softly, crossing himself. "No priest would bless her ground. No church would ring its bells." He placed a final stone carefully, then stood. "I will come. My tools will speak when prayers cannot." As evening approached, lantern light began to glow around the churchyard. One by one, their unlikely allies arrived. Josiah brought fence posts and tools, while Henry carried rope and wire he'd traded for with trappers. Manuel arrived with his stonemason's level and other tools, ready to ensure the fence would stand strong against winter storms. The men worked with quiet efficiency, measuring distances and marking post holes. Karen watched them from the church, steps struck by how naturally they moved together despite their different backgrounds. There was no need for many words. Each understood their part in the work. The sharp crack of hammer against post soon echoed through the gathering darkness. Nantan's powerful strikes drove each post deep, while Josiah's experienced hands guided the alignment. Henry's knowledge of the land helped them avoid hidden rocks, and Manuel's expertise ensured every angle was true. As the work continued, Karen felt tears welling in her eyes, not from grief this time, but from a profound gratitude. She stepped forward into the ring of lantern light, clasping her hands together. May I offer a prayer?" she asked hesitantly. The men paused their work, removing hats and standing respectfully. Even Henry, who followed different ways, bowed his head in recognition of her need to speak to her God. "Lord," Karen began, her voice trembling but growing stronger, "thank you for sending these good men to help protect this sacred ground. Thank you for showing us that when some hearts close their doors, other hearts open wider." She faltered for a moment, then continued, "Please bless their work and their kindness, and help us all remember that your love knows no boundaries of race or station." "Amen," Josiah said softly, and the word was echoed by Manuel, a tone. And Henry remained silent but nodded with respect. The work resumed, post holes being dug with renewed purpose. The steady rhythm of hammering filled the night air, each strike a defiance against those who would destroy this place of rest. Lantern light caught the rising fence posts, casting long shadows across the churchyard where Karen's daughter slept. Beneath the worn white cloth, the posts rose one by one, a boundary line drawn by hands that understood the true meaning of sanctuary. Dawn brought a crisp winter morning, the sun casting long shadows across the half-built fence that surrounded the churchyard. Steam rose from the parsonage chimney where Karen had risen early to prepare food for the workers. The smell of baking bread mingled with the sharp scent of pine from freshly cut posts. Inside the small kitchen, Karen kneaded dough with practiced hands, working through the familiar motions that had once filled her days with purpose. Now each press and fold felt like a prayer. A large pot of beans simmered on the wood stove, the only luxury she had kept after her husband's death. Through the window, She watched Nantan directing the other men with gentle authority. His massive frame moved with surprising grace as he demonstrated how to properly brace the fence posts. Josiah nodded in understanding, while Henry and Manuel worked together measuring distances with a length of rope. Heathens and savages, a woman's voice carried from the street. Decent folk ought not stand for it. Karen's hands stilled in the dough for a moment, then continued their work. She would not let bitter words poison this day of hope. As morning wore into afternoon, more townspeople gathered to watch the work, their faces a mixture of scorn and reluctant fascination. The sight of the men working in harmony, Apache, Black, Mexican, and Ute, seemed to confound them. Some turned away in disgust, but others lingered, perhaps seeing something that challenged their carefully maintained prejudices. Nantan coordinated the work with quiet efficiency. When Manuel suggested a better way to anchor the corner posts, Nantan listened carefully and adjusted the plan. When Henry spotted a natural drainage path that could weaken the fence line, they shifted the entire section. Each man's knowledge was respected. Each voice heard. Karen brought out bread still warm from the oven, along with bowls of beans seasoned with the last of her dried herbs. The men paused their work to eat, sitting in a rough circle on overturned buckets and logs. Their weathered hands cradled the simple food as if it were a feast. "Much obliged, ma'am," Josiah said, savoring a bite of bread. "Reminds me of my mama's cooking back in Tennessee." "The beans could use more chili," Manuel said with a gentle smile, "but they warm the belly well." The afternoon sun cast long shadows as the fence took final shape. Each post stood straight and true, the rails connecting them in clean lines that marked sacred space from common ground. Karen watched as Nantan hammered the last nail, his powerful strikes precise and purposeful. As dusk approached, Karen retrieved her daughter's tiny coffin from the church, cradling it close. The men removed their hats as she carried it through the new gate in the fence. Her steps were slow but steady as she placed it in the center of the enclosed space, adjusting the white cloth that still draped it. Kneeling beside the coffin, Karen's voice was soft but clear in the evening air. "Lord, protect this ground and this child. Let her rest in peace beneath your stars." She touched the cloth gently before rising. Josiah had built a small fire near the fence, and as darkness fell, they gathered around its warmth. Karen brought out the last of the bread and beans, and they shared this humble supper as stars began to appear above. "Reminds me of a night during the war," Josiah said, gazing into the flames. He spoke of a Christmas Eve when his unit had shared hardtack and coffee with Confederate prisoners, all of them singing carols together despite their divisions. His deep voice carried the story with gentle humor and wisdom. Karen surprised herself with a soft laugh at his description of the sergeant's face when both sides joined in silent night. The sound felt strange in her throat. She had not laughed since before her daughter's fever. Yet somehow it did not feel wrong, here in this circle of outcasts who had become allies as the fire burned low. The men took their leave one by one, each promising to return if the fence needed mending or the church needed protection. Karen watched them go, these unlikely guardians of her daughter's rest. She stood alone at the fence, her hands resting on the rough wood. Above, the winter stars blazed in the clear mountain sky, more brilliant than she remembered them being. Before, the same stars that had witnessed her grief now watched over this strange new fellowship. "Perhaps this is holy ground after all," she murmured, her words carrying all the weight of revelation. Not because of any church's blessing, but because of the dignity and kindness shown here today. Because of hands that built instead of destroyed, hearts that opened instead of turned away. The stars continued their silent vigil as Karen remained at the fence, feeling for the first time in many months that she was not alone in her watch. The night hung cold and still over the parsonage. Karen slept fitfully, wrapped in thin blankets, dreaming of her daughter's laugh. Nantan kept his customary vigil on the church steps, rifle across his knees. Watching shadows dance in the moonlight, a sharp, acrid smell pierced Karen's dreams. Smoke, her eyes flew open as the scent grew stronger, burning her throat. Through her window, an orange glow flickered against the dark sky. The crack and roar of flames filled the air. The church was burning. Before she could move, her door burst open. Nantan's massive frame filled the doorway, his face grim in the growing firelight. "Fire," he said tersely. "Railroad men, come quickly." Karen grabbed the white burial cloth from her bedside table as Nantan scooped her into his arms. The heat grew intense as he carried her down the narrow stairs and out into the bitter night air. Shouts echoed from the street, cruel, drunken laughter mixing with the sound of breaking glass. The church windows blazed like demon eyes. Flames licked up the wooden walls, consuming the old building with terrifying speed. Karen struggled in Nantan's arms as reality struck her. Her daughter's coffin was still inside. "No," she cried, breaking free of his grip. "My baby." Before Nantan could stop her, Karen ran toward the burning church. The heat slammed into her like a wall, but she pushed through the doors. Smoke filled her lungs as she stumbled down the center aisle. The familiar path to the altar seemed endless now, warped by flames and terror. Heavy footsteps pounded behind her. Nantan had followed. The coffin was just ahead, still draped in white. As Karen reached for it, a thunderous crack split the air. She looked up to see burning beams shifting overhead. "Karen," Nantan's voice boomed through the inferno. His powerful hands seized her waist, yanking her backward just as a massive beam crashed down where she had stood. Sparks exploded around them. Through the smoke, she saw the coffin disappear beneath the burning timber. "No, please, no." She fought against Nantan's iron grip as he dragged her toward the door. "My baby, I can't leave her." The heat was unbearable now. Nantan lifted her bodily, shielding her with his own massive frame as they burst out into the synth. Cold night air. Karen's legs gave way and she collapsed against his chest, racking sobs tearing from her throat. The white cloth she still clutched was stained with soot behind them. The church roof groaned. With a deafening crash, it caved in completely. A column of sparks shot skyward like a geyser of fireflies. Karen watched through tear-blurred eyes as flames devoured what remained of her sanctuary. Her daughter's resting place. Her grief emerged in horrible, keening wails that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Nantan held her tightly, his own face etched with anguish as he watched the destruction. Neither noticed the crowd gathering at a safe distance. Some shocked, others grimly satisfied. The night crawled toward dawn. One by one, their friends arrived, too late to help. Josiah's, usually. Steady voice shook with rage as he reported seeing railroad men fleeing the scene. Henry and Manuel worked with others to prevent the fire from spreading, but the church itself was beyond saving as the flames finally died down. Leaving only smoking ruins, Karen pulled away from Nantan's protective embrace, moving like a sleepwalker. She walked through the church's skeletal doorframe. Ash swirled around her feet with each step. The altar was gone, the pews reduced to charred stumps. Nothing remained of the tiny coffin. Karen sank to her knees in the ashes, unmindful of the heat still radiating from the ground. The sooty cloth hung limp in her hands. Her face was blank, eyes empty as she stared at the destruction around her. "Even God has forsaken me," she whispered, her voice as hollow as the ruins surrounding her. The rising sun cast weak light through the smoke-filled air, illuminating the devastation. Karen remained motionless among the ashes, a statue of grief. In the graveyard of her hopes, beyond her, Nantan stood silent guard. his warrior's heart breaking for a pain he could not fight. Dawn crept over the smoking ruins of the church, painting the sky in shades of ash and blood. The morning air still carried the acrid scent of destruction. One by one, their small group gathered among the charred timbers. Josiah, Henry, Manuel, and finally Karen, who emerged from the parsonage like a ghost, her face pale and drawn. Karen clutched the scorched white cloth to her chest, swaying slightly as she walked. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, as if she had cried out all her tears in the night. She settled on a fallen beam, rocking back and forth, the cloth moving with her like a living thing. Nantan paced the perimeter of the ruins, his massive frame coiled with barely contained fury. His boots crunched through the debris, kicking aside blackened splinters. Every few steps, he would pause to examine something, a boot print in the ash, an empty whiskey bottle, signs that told the story of the previous night's violence. Saw them running, Josiah said quietly, his voice heavy with anger. Railroad foreman's boys, drunk and laughing. Could name every one. Nantan's hands tightened on his rifle. Then I will find them, he growled, his dark eyes burning. We'll pay for this desecration. Karen's head snapped up at his words. No, she whispered, then louder. No. She stood, still clutching the cloth, and moved to block Nantan's path. Violence will only bring more violence. It will bury us both, deeper than my daughter's ashes. They must answer for this, Nantan insisted, his voice rough with emotion. Your child's rest was violated. Honor demands blood. My child rests in heaven now, Karen said, though her voice broke on the words. More death won't bring her back. Please, don't add murder to this tragedy. Nantan looked down at her, conflict etching deep lines in his weathered face. For a long moment, they stood frozen, the grieving mother and the warrior. Two kinds of pain meeting in the morning light. Then Nantan turned away sharply, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Without another word, he strode toward the hills, his long stride eating up the ground. Karen watched him go. One hand reached out as if to call him back. But no sound came from her lips. The day dragged on, heavy with sorrow. Karen moved through it like a sleepwalker, barely responding when the others tried to speak to her. She sat among the ruins, sometimes sifting through the ashes with trembling fingers. Sometimes just staring into nothing while rocking the cloth in her arms. As evening approached, Josiah found her still there. He carried a small oil lamp, its warm light pushing back the gathering shadows. The old soldier moved carefully, settling himself on a beam near Karen. My mama used to say that faith is strongest in the dark, he said softly, his deep voice gentle as a father's. Because that's when we need it most. Karen didn't look at him, but her rocking slowed. Your mama was wise, she whispered, but I don't know if I have any faith left to be strong. You do, Josiah assured her. I see it in how you stopped Nantan. Today, in how you still hold that cloth like it matters. In how you haven't given up, even now. Finally, Karen turned to meet his eyes. In the lamplight, tears traced silver paths down her cheeks. I feel broken, she admitted, shattered beyond any hope of repair. First my husband, then my daughter, now this. She gestured at the ruins around them. How much can one heart break before it stops beating altogether? Josiah was quiet for a moment, remembering his own dark times after the war. The heart is stronger than we know, he said finally. Like a tree in the wind, it bends, but does not break. And sometimes, when we're most broken, that's when the light finds its way in through the cracks. Karen's hands tightened on the cloth. I want to believe that, she whispered, but it hurts so much. Pain means you're still living, Josiah said gently, still fighting. And you're not fighting alone. They sat together in companionable silence as darkness settled over the valley. The lamp's flame flickered, casting long shadows across the ruined church. Miles away, on a ridge overlooking the town, Nantan stood motionless as a statue. His rifle rested in his hands, and his keen eyes picked out the railroad men's houses. Below, he could see them moving about their evening routines, laughing, drinking, celebrating their victory perhaps. It would be easy, so easy to make them pay. But Karen's words echoed in his mind. Violence will only bring more violence. He remembered the look in her eyes, the same desperate plea he'd seen in that missionary woman's face years ago, before. He'd lost his way in blood and vengeance. The warrior in him demanded justice. The man he was trying to become yearned for peace. Between these two desires, Nantan stood on the ridge as night fell, torn between the path of vengeance and the harder road of mercy below him. Lamplight glowed in windows like earthbound stars. Somewhere down there, Karen sat in the ruins of her sanctuary, holding the last remnant of her child. Nantan's finger traced the rifle's trigger guard, its decision hanging as delicate as a feather on the wind. The pale light of dawn crept across the valley, touching the charred ruins of the church with fingers of gold. Karen stepped carefully through the debris, the morning dew dampening her skirts. The scorched cloth was still clutched to her chest as it had been through the long, sleepless night. She paused beside a fallen beam, running her fingers over the singed fabric. In the clear morning light, she noticed something remarkable. While the edges were blackened, the cloth itself had survived nearly whole. The flames that had devoured the church, that had taken her daughter's coffin, had somehow spared this simple piece of white fabric. Karen spread it out before her, wonder replacing some of the grief in her eyes. The cloth rippled in the morning breeze like a flag of surrender, or perhaps of hope. Where there should have been holes, there was only softness. Where there should have been ash, there was still clean white between the scorched edges. "Lord," she whispered, her voice rough from crying, "is this a sign?" The thought settled in her heart like a warm coal, giving her strength. She knew where Nantan would be, up in the hills, where a warrior could watch the town below. Where a man bent on vengeance would plan his attack. Karen gathered her skirts and began the climb. The path was steep, winding through scrub brush and loose rocks. Her boots, not made for such terrain, slipped more than once. Still, she pressed on. The cloth held tight against her chest like a shield. The sun had risen fully by the time she spotted him. Nantan sat on a flat rock overlooking the valley, his broad back to her. His rifle lay across his knees, and his hands moved methodically as he cleaned the weapon. Even from behind, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the readiness for violence. Karen's heart ached at the sight. This man who had shown such gentleness, who had repaired her daughter's coffin with tender care, now prepared himself for killing. She stepped forward, letting a loose stone clatter to announce her presence. Nantan's head snapped around, his hands tightening on the rifle. When he saw it was her, his expression softened slightly, but the hardness remained in his eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he said, turning back to his task. "Go home, Karen." Instead, she moved closer until she stood just a few feet away. The morning wind tugged at her hair and the cloth in her hands. Below them, the town was waking, thin streams of smoke rising from chimneys like ghostly fingers. "I brought something to show you," Karen said softly. She held up the cloth, letting it unfurl between them. "Look at it, Nantan. Really look." He glanced up, irritation crossing his face, but then his eyes caught on the fabric. He saw what she had seen, the near miraculous preservation of the cloth that should have burned. "The fire touched it," Karen continued, her voice growing stronger, "but it didn't destroy it. This cloth that covered my daughter's coffin, it survived. Don't you see? This isn't meant for death. It's meant for life." Nantan's hands stilled on the rifle. He stared at the cloth as it moved in the wind, his expression conflicted. "They burned your church," he said roughly. "They destroyed your child's rest." Honor demands, we choose life." Karen interrupted. She stepped closer, her shadow falling across his hands. "This cloth survived for a reason. Not to wrap more death in, but to remind us that even in fire, something can remain." Whole Nantan's chest heaved with emotion. His fingers traced the rifle's barrel one last time. Then slowly, so slowly, he lowered the weapon to the ground. The metal made a soft clink against the stone. "I wanted to make them pay," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Karen said gently. "But payment in blood only brings more debt. Sometimes the bravest thing is to put down the weapon." They stood in silence as the sun climbed higher, the cloth moving between them like a living thing. Finally, Nantan rose to his feet, leaving the rifle on the rock. Without a word, he turned toward the path down. Karen fell into step beside him, matching his pace as they descended the hill together. Neither spoke, but something had shifted between them, a tentative peace. Fragile as morning frost, but just as real. When they reached the parsonage, Karen moved to her small table by the window. With careful hands, she spread the cloth flat, smoothing the wrinkles and burns with tender attention. Sunlight streamed through the glass, making the white fabric glow. "This was spared for a reason," she whispered, her fingers tracing the edges where fire had kissed but not consumed. In the quiet morning light, it looked almost like a promise. Nantan stood in the doorway, watching. The warrior's tension had eased from his shoulders, replaced by something softer. Something that looked almost like hope. Morning sunlight streamed through the parsonage windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Karen sat at her small table, fingers tracing the salvaged cloth as she had done countless times since the fire. Her eyes were distant, lost in thought. "We need to move her," she said softly, breaking the quiet. "Somewhere the railroad can't touch." Nantan looked up from where he sat cleaning his boots near the hearth. His dark eyes settled on Karen's face, reading the determination there. "I know a place," he said after a moment. "High in the mountains, there's a meadow where my people once made summer camp, sacred ground protected by steep cliffs." His voice grew distant with memory. "Wildflowers grow there, even when the valleys below are still touched by frost." Karen's hands stilled on the cloth. "How far?" "2 days by wagon, if the snow allows." Nantan stood, his tall frame casting a longer shadow. "But the trail is difficult. We would need help, and we'll ask for it," Karen said, rising with sudden purpose. She folded the cloth carefully, tucking it into her apron pocket. "We'll need supplies too, bread, blankets, tools for digging." They spent the morning gathering what they needed. Karen baked extra loaves while Nantan checked the wagon's wheels and axles. The old vehicle had seen better days, but it was sturdy. Enough for one last journey. By midday, they had visited their allies. Josiah Freeman was the first to agree, his weathered face solemn as he promised his help. "Ain't right what they did to your church," he said, already gathering his tools. "Least I can do is see this through." Henry, the Ute scout, nodded grimly when they explained their plan. "I know those trails," he said, checking his rifle. "Can guide you past the worst spots." His eyes met Nantan's with understanding. Both men knew the cost of lost sacred places. Manuel Ortega was last, and he crossed himself when Karen described the meadow. "See, I will come," he said, already reaching for his stoneworking tools. "Every child deserves a proper rest." They loaded the wagon as afternoon shadows lengthened. Blankets, food, tools, and water barrels were carefully secured. Karen watched her friends work, throat tight with emotion. These outcasts, these men society scorned, showed more Christian charity than any proper churchgoer in town. The sun was lowering when they finally set out. Karen driving the wagon while Nantan and Henry scouted ahead on foot. Josiah and Manuel followed behind, leading their horses loaded with extra supplies. The wagon wheels creaked through fresh snow, leaving deep tracks that would soon be covered by the constant mountain winds. The going was slow and difficult. Twice they had to stop to clear fallen branches from the trail. The wagon wheels caught in deep drifts, requiring all hands to push and dig them free. Cold wind cut through their coats, carrying the promise of more snow. "We should make camp soon," Henry called as dusk approached. "There's a sheltered spot ahead, good for fires." They found the spot just as true darkness fell, a natural hollow protected by towering pines. The men worked quickly to set up camp while Karen prepared a simple meal of bread and dried meat. Soon a cheerful fire crackled, pushing back the mountain. Cold as they ate, stories began to flow. Manuel spoke of his grandmother's village in Mexico, where every grave had its own guardian angel carved in stone. Josiah shared memories of spirituals sung at midnight services, his deep voice humming fragments of melody. Henry described Ute burial customs, speaking softly of sacred mountains and ancient songs. Nantan remained quiet, but his presence was steady, protective. He added wood to the fire when it dimmed, checked the horses, and made sure Karen had the warmest spot by the flames. When the meal was done and the stories had quieted, Karen felt moved to pray. She stood, the firelight catching on her face, and her voice trembled but held firm. "Lord," she began, "guide us on this journey. Watch over my daughter's rest and bless these good men who risk cold and hardship to help a stranger's child." Her voice grew stronger. "Thank you for showing us that your family is bigger than blood, that your love works through unexpected hands." "Amen," Josiah murmured, and the word was echoed around the fire. As the night deepened, they arranged their blankets close to the fire's warmth. The mountain wind sang through the pines, and stars wheeled overhead, bright and cold. Karen lay awake for a while, watching the flames dance and listening to the steady breathing of her companions. The meadow was still ahead, but something had already changed. In the midst of loss, she had found a new kind of family, one built not on proper society's rules, but on the deeper bonds of compassion and shared struggle. One by one, they drifted into sleep, huddled close against the cold. The fire burned low, casting a gentle glow over their faces. The black veteran, the Mexican craftsman, the Ute scout, the Apache warrior, and the preacher's daughter. An unlikely group, united in sacred purpose under the vast mountain sky. The night wrapped around them like a blanket, and even the wind seemed to quiet, as if keeping watch over their rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they slept in peace. The meadow waiting in their dreams. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of gold and rose as the small group continued their journey upward. The wagon wheels groaned under. The strain and their breath came in white puffs against the crisp morning air. 2 days of hard travel had worn deep lines in their faces, but determination kept them moving forward. Henry led the way, his skilled eyes finding the safest path. Through the treacherous terrain, Nantan walked beside the wagon, ready to brace it when the wheels slipped on patches of ice. Manuel and Josiah brought up the rear, their horses picking their way carefully along the narrow trail. Karen sat rigid on the wagon seat, her hands tight. On the reins, the cloth lay folded in her lap, a constant reminder of their purpose. Her mare struggled against the incline, and Karen whispered encouragement with each labored step. "Almost there," Nantan said softly, his eyes fixed on something ahead. "The meadow lies just beyond that ridge." As they crested the final rise, Karen drew in a sharp breath. Before them stretched a natural clearing, perfectly circular and ringed by towering pines. Fresh snow blanketed the ground in pristine white, untouched by human feet. Mountain peaks rose like sentinels around them, their jagged peaks piercing the crystal blue sky. "Oh," Karen whispered, one hand rising to her throat. "It's beautiful." Tears welled in her eyes as she took in the peaceful scene. "It feels holy." The men helped her down from the wagon, and they stood in reverent silence for a moment, absorbing the sanctity of the place. Wind whispered through the pines like a gentle hymn, and somewhere in the distance, an eagle called. Nantan moved forward, with purpose, his long stride carrying him to a slight rise where the snow lay thinner. He knelt, brushing away some of the white powder to reveal dark earth beneath. "Here," he said simply. "The ground will be softer here." They set to work without further discussion. Josiah and Manuel retrieved the shovels from the wagon while Henry gathered stones to mark the grave. Karen stood watching, clutching the cloth to her chest as the men began to dig. The work was slow and demanding. The ground, though not completely frozen, resisted their efforts. They took turns with the shovels, and when the tools proved insufficient, they used their hands, breaking through the stubborn earth with grim determination. Karen moved closer as the grave took shape, her eyes never leaving their progress. When Nantan's massive hands removed a particularly large stone, she knelt beside him, her smaller fingers joining his in clearing the earth. Together they worked, the preacher's daughter and the Apache warrior, preparing this final resting place. The sun had passed its peak when they finally stepped back. The grave was neat and deep, its walls as smooth as they could make them. Karen stood at its edge, the cloth trembling in her hands. "Would you like a moment?" Josiah asked gently. She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "Please stay. You're all part of this now." With infinite care, they gathered what remained of Karen's child, fragments of the burnt coffin, ashes they had carefully collected from the church ruins. Karen wrapped everything in the cloth, her movements slow and deliberate, as if performing a sacred ritual. Nantan stepped forward first, extending his hands. Karen placed her precious bundle in his massive palms, trusting him with this final task. The others gathered close as Nantan knelt, lowering the wrapped remains into the earth with the same gentleness he had shown when repairing the coffin those many days ago. Karen's composure finally broke. She sank to her knees beside the grave, tears flowing freely down her face. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper, a lullaby, sweet and sorrowful, drifting up toward the mountain sky. The men stood silent, heads bowed, as her song wove through the crisp air. The wind seemed to carry the melody, spreading it across the meadow like a blessing. A cave in the pines appeared to still their swaying. Kay listening to this mother's final farewell. When the last note faded, they began to fill the grave. Each man took his turn, carefully returning the earth they had removed. Karen remained kneeling, watching as the soil gradually covered the white cloth, her tears falling silently as Josiah smoothed the last of the dirt into place. Henry and Manuel arranged the gathered stones in a circle around the grave. The simple marker would endure long after they were gone, protecting this sacred space from disturbance. The sun was lowering toward the western peaks when they finished, casting long shadows across the meadow. Karen hadn't moved from her vigil, her face tear-stained but peaceful. Nantan approached quietly and placed his massive hand on her shoulder, offering silent comfort and respect. The touch seemed to release something in Karen. She covered his hand with her own, accepting the wordless support. Together they stood, guard over the small grave while around them the mountain wilderness kept its eternal watch. No railroad would ever reach this holy ground. No greed would disturb this peace. Here, high above the world of men, Karen's child would rest forever under open sky, protected by the ancient mountains and the love of unlikely guardians. Morning crept over the mountain peaks. painting the snow-laden meadow in soft shades of pearl and rose. The air hung crystal clear, each breath visible in delicate white puffs. Karen emerged from the small tent they had pitched, wrapping her shawl tighter against the mountain chill. Her eyes immediately found the fresh grave, its outline stark. Against the pristine snow, Nantan was already moving through the trees at the meadow's edge, his massive form dwarfing even the sturdy pines. He walked with purpose, studying each trunk with careful consideration. The others stirred in their bedrolls near the banked fire, watching as the Apache warrior worked. Finally, Nantan stopped before a young pine, straight and true. He ran his hand along its bark as if asking permission, then reached for the axe secured at his belt. The first blow rang through the quiet morning like a bell. Each strike that followed fell in a steady rhythm. Echoing off the surrounding peaks, Karen moved closer, drawn by the methodical sound. She watched as Nantan worked, his movements precise and respectful. The tree began to lean, then fell with a soft whoosh into the waiting snow. The crash of its landing seemed muffled by the reverent atmosphere of the meadow. Manuel approached with his carving tools, wrapped carefully in oiled leather. "We will make it beautiful," he said softly to Karen, his weathered hands already testing. The grain of the wood, Nantan stripped the branches with swift, sure strokes of his draw knife. Pine sap perfumed the air, fresh and clean. The trunk gradually transformed under his careful attention, becoming two sturdy beams that would form the cross. Josiah emerged from his bedroll, moving to help without being asked. He held the wood steady as Nantan shaped it, their movements coordinated by unspoken understanding. The morning light strengthened as they worked, casting long shadows across the snow. Manuel waited patiently, his carving tools laid out on a clean cloth. When Nantan finally stepped back from the roughly shaped cross, the Mexican stonemason moved forward. His skilled hands began tracing letters into the wood, each stroke deliberate and deep. "What verses would you like, Senora?" he asked Karen. Gently, Karen's voice trembled slightly as she recited from memory, "The Lord is my shepherd." Her words carried clearly in the still morning air as Manuel worked, the familiar psalm taking shape beneath his careful blade. The sun climbed higher as they labored. Henry tended the fire and prepared a simple breakfast, the smell of coffee mixing with the sharp scent of fresh-cut pine. They ate quickly, eager to complete their task. When Manuel finished the carving, Josiah stepped forward with the shovel. He dug carefully beside the grave, creating a deep hole to secure the cross. The earth, though cold, yielded more easily than it had the day before, as if accepting their purpose. Together, the men raised the cross. Nantan and Josiah held it steady while Manuel and Henry packed soil around its base, tamping it down firmly. They stepped back one by one, leaving Karen alone before the simple monument. She approached slowly, the singed cloth cradled in her arms. The morning light caught the fabric's burned edges, turning them to gold. Her hands shook slightly as she raised the cloth, but her movements were sure as she draped it across the wooden beams. The white fabric settled into place, its damaged edges somehow perfect against the rough carved wood. Karen stood very still, her eyes fixed on the cross. When she finally turned to face Nantan, tears tracked silently down her cheeks. "You took it," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed meadow, and were shattered. Her eyes held his, unafraid of his towering presence. "But now, you've given it back and I am whole." Nantan's stoic expression cracked. Something raw and vulnerable flashed across his weathered features. He took a half step forward, then stopped. Overwhelmed by emotion, he seemed unable to voice. Karen moved closer, reaching up to touch his arm. The gesture bridged more than physical distance. It spanned the gulf between their worlds, between past wounds and present healing. Nantan's massive frame seemed to tremble beneath her gentle touch. Without discussion or signal, they all found themselves kneeling in the snow before the cross. The rough-hewn pines stood straight against the sky, Manuel's careful carving catching the strengthening light. The white cloth moved slightly in the mountain breeze, like a banner of peace, as they knelt together, the widow, the warrior, the veteran, the stonemason, and the scout. The clouds above the meadow parted. Sunlight poured through the opening, pure and strong, illuminating the cross and the small grave beside it. The beam of light transformed the simple marker into something magnificent, turning the snow-covered meadow into a cathedral of nature. The white cloth glowed in the sudden radiance, its burned edges seeming to fade in the brilliant light. Karen's soft weeping was the only sound in the vast stillness. But these were different tears than those she had shed before, not the bitter drops of grief, but the healing waters of peace finally found. They remained kneeling as the light bathed the meadow, each lost in private thoughts and prayers. The mountain winds whispered through the pines like a choir, and somewhere in the distance, an eagle called again a wild benediction over this holy ground. The weeks that followed brought gradual change to the mountain meadow, like spring snow melting into new grass. Word trickled down from town that the railroad had abandoned its plans for the old church site. The company's surveyors found easier ground to the west, where the slopes were gentler and the bribes less costly. The burned ruins stood untouched, a silent reminder of darker days now passing. Up in the meadow, life took root in unexpected ways. The small camp that had sheltered them during the burial grew into something more permanent, and 10 skillful hands, once wrapped around weapons, now shaped logs and raised walls. The cabin took shape slowly, each beam and board a testament to patience and purpose. Karen watched from beside the morning fire as Josiah and Nantan worked together, lifting heavy timbers into place. The two men moved with easy familiarity now. Their differences dissolved in shared labor. Josiah's quiet strength complemented Nantan's raw power, and between them, Kabine's framework rose steady and true. Manuel arrived every few days, his tools rattling in his wagon, his skilled touch transformed rough-cut wood into fitted joints and smooth surfaces. He worked singing softly in Spanish, old hymns mixing with the tap of his hammer and the whisper of his plane. Henry appeared like a shadow when least expected, often bearing fresh game or news from his wide wanderings. His sharp eyes kept watch over their growing sanctuary, though his wariness softened with each peaceful sunset. Sometimes he would sit late into the evening, sharing stories of the mountains with Nantan in low tones. The cabin grew room by room. First came the main space with its stone fireplace, Manuel's careful masonry ensuring the chimney drew true. Then the sleeping quarters, small but snug against mountain winds. A covered porch emerged last, facing east toward the grave and its cross. Where the white cloth still flew like a banner of peace, Karen found herself humming as she worked, old hymns returning unbidden to her lips. She planted a small garden beside the cabin, turning earth that had lain untouched since creation. The simple act of pushing seeds into soil felt like a prayer, a testament to continuing life. The evening meal became a sacred time, whether shared by two or by all. Karen would stand in the cabin's doorway, calling them in from their various labors. They gathered around the rough-hewn table, hands clasped in familiar circle. Where once her prayers had faltered, now they flowed sure and strong. "We thank you, Lord," she would say, her voice carrying clear in the quiet room, "for this food, this shelter, and these dear ones gathered here." The others would murmur their amens, even Henry adding his soft voice to the chorus. Nantan took charge of the hearth, treating the fire with the same reverence he once gave to warrior ceremonies. His massive hands could coax warmth from the dampest wood, and he kept the flame burning steady through long mountain nights. Sometimes Karen would catch him staring into the flames, his expression softened by firelight and peace. The meadow itself seemed to welcome their presence. Deer ventured closer, grazing in the morning mist. Birds returned to nest in nearby trees, their songs greeting each dawn. Even the winds grew gentler. Or perhaps they had simply learned to better weather the storms. The cross stood unchanged through sun and rain, its white cloth somehow resisting the elements. Manuel had carved more verses into the base as space, allowed until scripture spiraled around the wood like a living thing. Karen tended it daily, smoothing the cloth and clearing away fallen needles. But now her visits carried more peace than pain. One evening, as summer faded toward autumn, Karen stood before the cross in the deepening dusk. The setting sun painted the meadow in shades of gold and purple, each blade of grass touched with fire. She heard Nantan's approach, his footsteps nearly silent despite his size. He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his massive frame. Together they watched the cloth stir in the evening breeze, its edges catching the last rays of sunlight. "Do you remember," Karen said softly, "that first night in the church, when you took this cloth away?" Atone nodded, his expression distant. "With memory? Huh, I thought it hit a curse," he answered, his deep voice barely above a whisper. Instead, it revealed a blessing. Karen turned to look up at him, seeing how time and peace had softened the hard lines of his face. The warrior's scars remained, but they seemed to sit lighter now, like old wounds, finally healing clean. "We were both so alone then," she said. Her hand found his, fingers twining together with familiar ease. His rough palm engulfed her smaller one, warm and steady. So lost in our separate darkness, Nantan's grip tightened gently. "The darkness taught us to see," he replied, wisdom threading through his words. "Like night teaches us to know stars." The sun slipped behind the mountains, painting the clouds in brilliant farewell. Long shadows stretched across the meadow, but they held no terror now. The cabin's windows began to glow with lamplight, promising warmth and welcome. From inside came the sounds of their family gathering. Josiah's deep laugh mingled with Manuel's melodic voice. Henry's quiet footsteps moved across the porch. The smell of coffee and fresh bread drifted out on the evening air. Karen leaned closer to Nantan's solid presence, feeling the last warmth of day fade into twilight's cool breath. Her voice carried all the certainty that had once been lost to grief, all the faith that had been reborn in this sacred place. "We are not alone anymore," she whispered, the words rising like a prayer into the gathering dark. The cloth rippled gently on its cross, pale against the deepening blue of the sky. First stars began to appear, bright and steady as promises kept. Peace settled over the meadow like a blessing, wrapping around them all the widow and the warrior, the veteran and the scout, the craftsman and the outcasts who had become family behind them. The cabin door opened wider, spilling golden light. Across the ground, voices called them in to supper, to the simple rituals of bread, broken, and thanksgiving, to the quiet miracle of belonging, found in the last place any of them had thought to look. Karen and Nantan turned together toward the welcoming light. Their joined hands swung gently between them as they walked, a bridge built of trust and time, of wounds healed and faith restored. The path was well-worn now, familiar beneath their feet. The meadow settled into evening silence around the glowing cabin. Inside, the family gathered close, their shadows moving across curtained windows. Outside, the white cloth kept its vigil on the cross, luminous in the starlight, no longer a symbol of loss, but a banner of hope, visible to any other weary travelers who might find their way to this mountain sanctuary. Thank you for watching. If this one reached you, consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.